Ancient Greece is one of the most famous civilizations in history. Its gods, its philosophers, its wars, they've shaped human imagination for 2,500 years. Most of us have at least some familiarity with the stories. Zeus, Athena, Apollo, we know the names. But the religion behind those names, the actual lived practice, what people did every day, what they feared, what they hoped for, that's a different story altogether. And it's one most of us have never really heard. Because there was a lot more going on than simply telling stories and visiting temples. So, what did Greek religion actually look like? Not the myths, the religion. Let's find out. One thing worth saying before we dive in, and this is important, ancient Greek religion is not one thing. It varied across centuries, across regions, across social classes. Athens did things differently from Sparta. Crete was different from Corinth. What we're doing in this episode is something closer to a guided introduction, a way in, not the final word. Scholars disagree about almost everything we're going to discuss. And where there's real disagreement, I'll try to let you see both sides. So, with that said, let's start with the single most important thing to understand about Greek religion, which is that the word religion is already misleading. When we hear that word, we tend to carry a set of assumptions shaped largely by the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. We expect a founder, a holy book, a creed, a church, some kind of institution that tells you what to believe and how to practice it. Ancient Greek religion had none of these things. No Greek prophet stood on a mountain and received divine truth. No scripture was agreed upon as the word of the gods. No creed defined what every Greek had to believe. And no institution existed to decide who was orthodox and who was a heretic. So what was there instead? The answer is practice. Customs and rituals, the things you do, not the things you believe. And this has enormous implications for how the whole system worked. Because if there's no holy book, there's no one correct version of any story. Different cities could tell different versions of the same myth, and both could be right. If there's no church, there's no institution deciding who's orthodox and who's a heretic. You couldn't be excommunicated from Greek religion, though you could be accused of impiety if you refused to participate in the community's rituals. And if there's no creed, nobody asks what you privately think about the gods. What they ask is whether you're showing up at the altar and doing what your ancestors did. This is a fundamentally different way of organizing a religious world. And to understand how it worked in practice, we need a few Greek words. Just a few, and I'll explain each one. The scholar Valerie Warrior makes this point clearly. The Greeks didn't even have an all-embracing word for what we call religion. The closest they got was a phrase, theus sebastai, which means to be in awe of the gods, to show them proper respect. And the key concept that came from that was eusebeia, the Greek word for piety. But it didn't mean what we usually mean by piety. It meant something closer to doing the right thing, the proper thing. Not believing the right thing, actually doing it. And the opposite, asebeia, which we'd translate as impiety, wasn't doubt or disbelief. It was failure to honor the gods correctly. It was neglecting the sacrifices, ignoring the festivals, violating the customs that your ancestors handed down. So the first thing to understand is this. Greek religion was not a system you believed in. It was a system you participated in. And that participation started somewhere very specific. not at a great temple or a public festival, but at the family hearth. The Greek household, or the oikos as they called it, was not just a home in our modern sense. It was a family unit, an economic unit, and a religious unit all at once. And at its center was the hearth fire, and the goddess who lived in it. Her name was Hestia, and her name literally is just the Greek word for hearth. She wasn't a dramatic mythological character. She doesn't appear in many stories, but she was, in a very real sense, the most constantly present god in any Greek's life, because she was the fire you kept burning in your house. Walter Burkert, in his landmark study called Greek Religion, argues that in Greek thinking, to destroy a family was to drive out a hearth. The hearth was the family, the fire was the center, and the fire was where worship happened, every day, without priests or temples or special occasions. Before a family ate, a small offering went into the flames, a splash of wine, a bit of food, a few quiet words. This wasn't a grand ceremony. It was more like saying grace, except you were feeding the fire, and the fire was the goddess, and the goddess was the center of your home. But Hestia wasn't the only divine presence in the house. Zeus showed up in the household too, not as the thunderbolt-throwing king of Olympus, but in more intimate forms. As Zeus Ktesios, he was the protector of the household stores, sometimes represented by a simple storage jar decorated with garlands of wool. As Zeus Herkaios, he was the guardian of the household boundary, the courtyard, the fence, the line between family space and the world outside. Hermes watched over the threshold, the point where inside became outside. A stone pillar just beyond the door might mark the presence of Apollo, guardian of the street beyond. And Hecate waited at the crossroads just past it. But the really important point is this: the household wasn't just where you lived, it was where the major transitions of human life were given religious shape. Every passage, birth, growing up, marriage, death, was marked by ritual that connected the family to the gods. A newborn child wasn't automatically part of the family. Within days of birth came the amphidromia, a ceremony in which the father carried the baby around the hearth fire, circling it, formally bringing the child into the household's sacred community. Only after this did the child truly belong. Later, at the festival of the Apaturia, boys were formally introduced into their father's wider kinship group through further rituals involving sacrifice and feasting. The same logic carried through every major transition in life. When a woman married, she wasn't just changing households. She was leaving one sacred world and entering another. She was introduced to her husband's household gods, welcomed into his sacred world. The wedding procession, with torches, songs, and the bride's veil, wasn't just celebration. It was a passage from one hearth to another. And at the end of life, the same obligation held. The body was washed and anointed. Mourners, usually women, performed formal lamentations. A coin might be placed in the mouth for the journey. And in the days and months after burial, further offerings were brought to the grave. You had to feed the dead, remember them, pour libations at their tombs. The neglected dead were dangerous. They could return, unhappy, to trouble the living. So Greek religion didn't start with something dramatic. It started with fire and family and the habits that held a household together. It was ordinary, it was daily, and it was everywhere. But what happened in the home was just the smallest version of something much bigger. Because the same logic, honoring the gods through practice, custom, and shared ritual, organized the entire city. The Greeks called it the polis, the city-state. And the polis was not a secular state that occasionally hosted religious events. It was a religious community. The gods didn't just live in the city's temples. In a real sense, The city belonged to its gods. And this is not a metaphor. Modern people are trained to separate religion from politics, government, and public life. In the Greek world, that separation doesn't make any sense. Religion was embedded in every corner of civic life, in how wars were decided, how laws were made, how communities celebrated and mourned. It was part of how a community defined itself. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, gives us the clearest picture of this. When the Athenians needed to explain to the Spartans what it meant to be Greek, what all Greeks shared, Herodotus records what they said. And it's worth hearing the exact words because they're very revealing. Quote, "Being Greek means having the same blood and language, common shrines of the gods and sacrifices, and the same kinds of customs." Unquote. Notice what's in that list and what isn't. No theology, no doctrine, no shared beliefs about the nature of the gods. What makes Greeks Greek is shared shrines, sacrifices, and customs. Basically, shared actions, not shared ideas. And each city took this seriously. Athens had Athena as its patron, worshipped there under the title Athena Polias, which simply means Athena of the city. She wasn't just the city's mascot. The Parthenon was her house, her treasury, the physical symbol of everything Athens claimed to be. The great Panathenaic festival was the clearest example of this. Once every 4 years, the whole city turned out, a massive procession moving through the streets, carrying a newly woven robe as a gift to the goddess. There were sacrifices, athletic competitions, musicians. The city, at its most organized and its most beautiful, presenting itself to the power that protected it. And this wasn't just Athens. Corinth honored Poseidon and Aphrodite. Argos belonged to Hera. Sparta had its own distinct religious calendar and festivals. Every city had its own sacred calendar, an official schedule of festivals, sacrifices, and holy days that organized the entire civic year. As the scholar Robert Parker argues, the polis took on the role that a church plays in later religious traditions. It was the city that anchored, organized, and policed religious activity. But it did all of this without theology, without a professional clergy defining doctrine, and without claiming to possess revealed truth. What held it together was something much simpler: custom. The things your ancestors did, that you do, that your children will do after you. And this mattered in real, practical ways. Consider what happened at Thermopylae in 480 BCE, one of the most famous military engagements in Greek history, the moment when a small Greek force held off the Persian army at a narrow mountain pass. The Spartans, the greatest warriors in Greece, couldn't send their full army. Not because they lacked the men, because the Carneia festival was in progress, and the sacred calendar took priority over the battle. Parker cites this as one of the clearest examples of just how seriously the Greeks took their religious obligations. The festival came first. That's not a civilization treating religion as mere decoration. One more thing about the city's religious world, and it's something that trips up almost everyone. When modern people picture Greek religion, they picture temples, the Parthenon, Delphi, beautiful columns against blue sky. And they imagine something like a church, a building you enter for worship, where a congregation gathers inside. This is almost entirely wrong. A Greek temple was not a church. It was the house of the god, the place where the god's statue lived, where sacred treasuries were stored. The most important religious action didn't happen inside the temple. It happened outside, at the altar, in the open air. Think about what that means. When a Greek city performed a sacrifice, the community gathered not in a building, but around a fire under the sky. The smoke went up. The statue of the god might be visible through the temple doors behind them. But the altar was the center, not the building. And the sanctuary, the temenos, as the Greeks called it, was much more than just a temple and an altar. A major sanctuary like Delphi included treasuries from dozens of different cities, votive offerings hanging on every surface, sacred trees and springs, dining areas where communities ate after sacrifice, sometimes a theater or stadium for festival competitions. It was a whole landscape of divine space, not just a single building. Even small rural sanctuaries mattered. Not every sacred place was Delphi. The Greek countryside was dense with local shrines, small altars, roadside herms, cave sanctuaries, sacred stones and springs, where ordinary people made small offerings as part of the ordinary rhythm of life. The divine wasn't concentrated in a few grand locations. It was spread across the landscape. And at the center of all of it, from the great sanctuary at Delphi to the simplest rural shrine, was the same thing: the altar. The altar was where people came to sacrifice, and animal sacrifice was the central act of Greek religion, not one practice among many, but the defining one. If you want to understand what Greek religion actually felt like from the inside, you have to start here. So let's walk through it together, step by step, as the ancient sources describe it. A procession approaches the altar. The participants have washed their hands, and some are wearing garlands. A flute player accompanies them. The sacrificial animal, a cow, a sheep, a goat, a pig, depending on the occasion, walks in the procession too, adorned with ribbons, sometimes with gilded horns. Everyone hopes the animal walks willingly. That matters. If the animal resists, it's a bad sign. If it seems to go forward on its own, the gods are pleased. At the altar, water is passed around. Everyone washes their hands. The animal is sprinkled with water and shakes its head, and the Greeks interpret that as the animal nodding its assent. Silence falls. The person leading the sacrifice raises his arms and prays, calling the god by name and title, reminding the god of past sacrifices, making a request, promising future offerings. Then everyone throws handfuls of barley grain forward, onto the altar and the animal together. And then the knife comes out of the basket. What happens next is intense, and I want to describe it carefully, because this is the moment that separates Greek religion from anything most modern viewers have experienced. Smaller animals are lifted above the altar and their throats are cut. For a large animal like an ox, the process is different. The ox is stunned first with a blow from an axe, then the artery in the neck is opened. Burkert describes what follows in a passage that's worth hearing exactly as he wrote it. Quote, "The blood is collected in a basin and sprayed over the altar and against the sides. To stain the altar with blood is a pious duty. As the fatal blow falls, the women must cry out in high, shrill tones. The Greek custom of the sacrificial cry marks the emotional climax. Life screams over death." Unquote. That last line stays with you. Life screams over death. The shrill cry of the women was one of the most distinctive sounds of Greek religion. It marked the exact moment when life became death, when the ordinary became sacred. After the killing, the inner organs, the heart and the liver, are roasted on the altar fire first and tasted immediately by those closest to the ritual. This is the innermost circle of participation. Then the thigh bones, wrapped in fat, are placed on the fire for the gods. Wine is poured over the flames, and the alcohol flares. The smoke rises, and in Greek thinking, this is how the offering reaches the gods. Through smoke, through scent, through the rising column of fire. After the gods' portion has burned, the rest of the meat is prepared, roasted or boiled, and the community eats together. Sometimes every scrap has to be consumed on the spot, nothing taken home. What began as a killing ends as a feast. But let me back up for a moment, because the prayer that comes before the killing matters too. And it tells you a lot about how Greeks thought about their relationship with the divine. Greek prayer had a structure. It wasn't free-form personal meditation. You called on the god by name, and by the right name, the right epithets, the right local titles. You reminded the god of where he could be found, which sanctuary, which city. You then reminded the god of your past relationship, the sacrifices you'd given before, the honors you'd paid. And only then did you make your request. Victory in battle, a safe voyage, healing for a sick child, rain for the crops. And you finished with a promise, future offerings, future dedications, future sacrifices if the god came through. This isn't begging. It's negotiation between parties who know each other. And the question that always comes up, was this just bribery? Has a better answer than most people expect. Parker explores this through a beautiful passage about Achilles praying to Zeus in the Iliad. Achilles pours a libation from a special cup he reserves exclusively for Zeus. He recalls the god's past help. He makes his plea. And Parker's comment on this cuts to the heart of the matter. Quote, "What is at issue is not therefore a simple do ut des, whereby one gift buys one benefit, but a continuing relationship." Unquote. In other words, sacrifice wasn't a transaction. It was a relationship. You gave to the gods, and the gods might give back. You remembered them, and they might remember you. You honored them this year, and next year, and the year after, and the relationship deepened over time. It was more like tending a long friendship than inserting a coin in a vending machine. And the Greeks themselves were aware that the arrangement was, frankly, a little strange. Because here's the thing. At a typical sacrifice, the gods got the bones, the fat, and the smoke. The humans got the meat. The unequal division was obvious, and the Greeks knew it. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod told a story to explain how this came about. At the very first sacrifice, he says, Prometheus, the great Titan trickster of Greek myth, divided the slaughtered ox into two portions. One pile had the meat, hidden under the stomach lining. The other had only bones, wrapped in glistening fat to look appealing. He offered Zeus his choice. Zeus chose the fat, and when he realized he'd been fooled, he was furious. But the division stuck, and for centuries, Greek comedy writers milked the joke. The gods of Olympus, rulers of the universe, getting the bones while humans feasted on the meat. It was absurd, and everyone knew it. Which raises a question worth asking. How can something that is so clearly not a fair gift actually work as a gift? But it did work. And the answer has two parts. The gods, according to the Greeks, received something real. Not the meat, but the honor, the acknowledgement. The smoke rising toward the sky was a declaration. We remember you. We need you. We belong to you. That was the divine portion. But what about the humans? Well, they received each other. A community that kills together, eats together, and prays together at the same fire, year after year. That is a community that knows it belongs together. Everyone had a role. The girl who carried the basket, the musician, the priest who prayed and made the cut, the women whose cry marked the moment, and the citizens who ate together afterward. The sacrifice made the community real. Now, I should make clear that blood sacrifice was the most dramatic and most central form of offering, but it wasn't the only one. Not even close. Greeks poured libations constantly. Wine, honey, milk, water, olive oil, at all kinds of occasions. Before a meal, before a journey, before battle, after a treaty. Libations were so common that the Greek word for a peace treaty, spondai, literally just means libations. You made peace by pouring wine together. They offered cakes, incense, and the first fruits of the harvest. They dedicated objects at sanctuaries, bronze figurines, weapons, jewelry, painted pottery, terracotta statuettes, even entire suits of armor stripped from defeated enemies. These dedications piled up in sanctuaries over centuries, turning places like Delphi and Olympia into dense forests of offerings. Each one a record of someone's gratitude, someone's fear, someone's answered prayer. People who were healed at sanctuaries of Asclepius sometimes dedicated terracotta replicas of the body part that was cured: a leg, an arm, an eye. These votive body parts are among the most moving objects that survive from the ancient world. They're records of real people in real pain who believed a god had helped them. The logic was always the same: honor, reciprocity, relationship. Give to the gods, maintain the connection, and keep the world in order. So, up until now, we've been looking at where the Greeks met their gods: the hearth, the altar, the sanctuary, sacred places. But there's another dimension we haven't touched yet. What about time? Because the gods didn't only live in certain places, they lived in certain days too. And there were a lot of those days. Every Greek city had its own festival calendar, dozens of sacred occasions per year, each one tied to a particular god, a season, a civic memory. And these weren't optional extras layered on top of ordinary life. They were ordinary life. A festival could be joyful or solemn or frightening. It could involve athletic competition, theatrical performance, or women-only rituals that excluded men entirely. But it was always serious, and it was always communal. As Burkert puts it simply, the sanctuary organized space, and the festival organized time. Certain days were set apart from ordinary life. Work stopped. Normal roles shifted. The festival took over. The Pan-Athenaia is the clearest example of this. Every 4 years, the Greater Pan-Athenaia drew participants from across the Greek world. A massive procession wound through the streets of Athens, up toward the Acropolis, carrying a newly woven robe, the peplos, for the goddess. Athletes competed in running, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing. Musicians competed too. The prizes were jars of sacred olive oil from Athena's own sacred groves, oil from trees the Greeks believed the goddess herself had created. Practical wealth and divine blessing in the same jar. And through it all ran the deep civic logic. This was Athens, at its most beautiful and most organized, presenting itself to the power that made it possible. But not every festival belonged to the whole city. Take Thesmophoria, for example, and it shows a dimension of Greek religion that often gets overlooked. The Thesmophoria was a festival of Demeter and Persephone, the goddess of grain, and her daughter, held across the Greek world, and it was restricted to citizen women. Men were excluded entirely. For 3 days, women gathered, fasted, and performed rites that involved sacred objects and pig remains that had been deposited in underground pits months earlier. The details varied by city, but the function was consistent: agricultural fertility, civic renewal, and, crucially, female religious authority. The Thesmophoria reminds us that Greek religion wasn't only the domain of male citizens. Women had their own sacred spaces, their own rituals, their own forms of religious power. And the city needed those rituals. The women's rites were considered essential, not optional, not supplementary, but necessary for the health of the community. And then there was the frightening kind. The Anthesteria was a 3-day festival in Athens dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. And frightening is exactly the right word for it. On the first day, the new wine jars were ceremonially opened. On the second day, there was drinking. But something else was happening too, something that sits outside the boundaries of what we'd call a normal celebration. Ancient sources suggest that on this day, the dead were believed to return and walk among the living. The Athenians took this seriously, not as folklore, but as genuine religious reality. The boundary between the world above and the world below grew thin. Normal social distinctions loosened, and strangers and slaves drank alongside citizens. Everything that was usually kept separate was, for one day, allowed to mix. And then came the third day. The boundary had to be restored. There was a ritual for this, a spoken formula that closed what the festival had opened. Burkert, in his description of the Anthesteria, records the closing ritual clearly and tells us the formula was simple. At the end of the third day, the Athenians would speak these words: "Out, Eukeres, the Anthesteria is over." And what's remarkable is that those words have survived. They're preserved in the ancient sources themselves, 2,500 years later. Think about what that tells us. The Greeks didn't just open the festival and hope for the best. They had a specific formula for closing it. The gods belonged to the divine world. The dead belonged below. And when the festival was over, they needed to go back. Which tells you something important. The dead were not just a memory in ancient Greece. They were a presence that had to be managed. But in ancient Greece, some of the dead were more than just a presence. Some of them had a name, a tomb, and a cult. In modern English, a hero is someone brave. In Greek religion, a hero was something more specific. A dead person, usually from the distant past, who was believed to retain power after death. Heroes received cult at their tombs. They could protect the communities associated with their graves, and they could also be dangerous if neglected. As Parker argues, heroes functioned essentially as local gods, not as powerful as the Olympians, but tied to specific places and communities in ways that the great gods were not. Take the soldiers who died at Marathon in 490 BCE. Marathon being a place, a coastal plain north of Athens, not the running race, though the race does take its name from there. These men died fighting off the Persian invasion. And they weren't just remembered, they were worshipped. Every year, the Athenians returned to their burial mound and performed sacrifice in their honor. Heracles is another example, and an interesting one, because he sits right on the boundary. Sometimes worshipped as a hero, sometimes as a god, depending on where you were and who you asked. And across the Greek world, almost every city had its own local founder hero, a figure from the distant past whose tomb sat somewhere in the community, whose power was believed to still protect it. But it wasn't only the famous dead who mattered. Even ordinary dead people needed care. Funeral rites were religious necessities, not just social conventions. You had to bury your dead, feed them with offerings, pour libations at their graves. The unburied dead were dangerous. The neglected dead could cause harm. The relationship between the living and the dead was ongoing, another dimension of the same religious logic that governed everything else. Maintain the relationship, perform the correct actions, keep the world in order. So far, Greek religion may sound communal, festive, and well-ordered, but it also had a much more anxious side. Because approaching the gods wasn't just a matter of showing up. You had to show up in the right condition. You might ask, what did that mean, the right condition? The Greeks had a word for the wrong condition, miasma, usually translated as pollution, though that word doesn't quite capture it. Miasma wasn't primarily about morality, at least not in the way we think about it. It was about state, a condition that made you temporarily unfit to approach the sacred. What could cause it? Well, death was the most obvious one. If you'd been near a corpse, you needed to purify yourself before entering a sanctuary. Childbirth, too. Sex, and contact with blood, human blood most of all. And if that blood came from murder, the pollution was in a category of its own. Now, the logic wasn't that these things were morally wrong. Birth and death are natural. Sex is natural. But they put you in a state where you weren't ready to stand before a god. You needed to be clean first. You needed to wash, to wait, to pass through a transition before approaching the sacred. Murder was the extreme case. A murderer carried a pollution so severe that it affected everyone around him. He couldn't eat at the same table as other people. He couldn't enter a sanctuary. He was cut off from the community until he'd been purified. And purification required specific rituals, often involving the blood of a sacrificed animal poured over the killer's hands and head. The irony is brutal. You cure blood pollution with more blood. But even ordinary, everyday pollution required attention. Homer makes this vivid. In the Iliad, the Trojan warrior Hector returns from the battlefield and refuses to pour a libation to Zeus before purifying himself. His words, as Warrior translates them, are worth hearing. Quote, "Reverence keeps me from pouring gleaming wine to Zeus in libation with hands unwashed. No one splattered with blood and gore can pray to the son of Cronus, lord of the dark clouds." Unquote. That's not guilt in the modern psychological sense. It's respect for a boundary. You don't walk from a battlefield into sacred space without stopping to make yourself clean. The gods require a certain kind of approach. And this wasn't just a poetic idea. Real inscriptions, carved in stone and posted at the entrances of sanctuaries, regulated who could enter, what they had to do first, how long they had to wait after certain kinds of contact. These were public rules, enforced by the community on behalf of the gods. But the relationship with the divine wasn't just one-directional. The Greeks also believed the gods could speak back, and people desperately wanted to hear what they had to say. The main channel was the oracle, and the most famous oracle in the Greek world was at Delphi. Delphi was the sanctuary of Apollo, perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a genuinely dramatic setting, cliffs and gorges and eagles. At the center of the sanctuary stood the temple, and inside the temple was the Adyton, the inner sanctum. And in the Adyton, seated on a tripod over a cleft in the rock, was the Pythia. She was a woman dedicated to Apollo's service. After preparation, bathing, sacrifice, fumigation with laurel, she entered a state of trance or intense concentration and delivered responses to the questions brought to her. And these weren't small questions. Cities asked the Pythia whether they should go to war, whether they should found a colony, how to end a plague, how to appease an angry god. Individuals came with personal crises, sickness, lost property, difficult decisions. The questions were specific and practical. The answers could be direct or cryptic, and interpretation mattered enormously. Greek tragedy is full of stories about oracles that were technically accurate, but catastrophically misunderstood. But Delphi was just the most famous point in a much wider system of divine communication. Dodona, in northwest Greece, was an oracle of Zeus, where questions were written on lead tablets, many of which survive, giving us a remarkable window into what ordinary people asked the gods. Shall I take up farming? Am I the father of this child? Should my son go to sea? These are real questions from real people brought to a real God in a real place. Beyond the oracles, there were seers, the Greeks called them mantes, who traveled with armies and read the will of the gods in the entrails of sacrificed animals. Before major battles, generals waited for the seer's verdict. If the omens were bad, the army didn't move. Bird flights were observed and interpreted. Thunder, lightning, eclipses, unusual events, all could be read as divine messages. And then there were healing sanctuaries, especially those of Asclepius, where sick people came to sleep on sacred ground, a practice called incubation. They would fast, purify themselves, and sleep in a special hall, hoping that the god Asclepius would appear to them in a dream and prescribe a cure. The votive offerings left behind, those terracotta body parts, are evidence that people believed it worked. As Parker notes, oracles played a crucial role in the Greek religious system. They provided what was essentially limited revelation, the god answering specific questions about specific practices. Not theology, not doctrine, but practical guidance. How to sacrifice correctly, which new cult to introduce, how to make things right when something had gone wrong. Greek religion had no sacred book, but it had the oracle, a narrow, specific channel through which the divine will could sometimes be heard. But there was one more dimension to this world, and it's the strangest one. Because everything we've talked about so far, the hearth, the altar, the festival, the oracle, happened in the open. Anyone could see it. Anyone could participate. The Greeks, though, practiced something that worked on entirely different terms, something so powerful, so carefully guarded, that initiates went to their deaths without ever describing what they had seen. They called them the mysteries. Imagine standing outside a hall in the middle of the night, torches burning, the sound of chanting somewhere in the darkness ahead. You've fasted for days. You've carried sacred objects you're not allowed to describe, and you're about to go inside, into something that, for the rest of your life, you will never speak about to anyone. That was the rule. You could not speak of what happened inside. Not to your spouse, not to your closest friend, not to anyone. And across centuries, through wars, conquests, the rise of new empires and new religions, people kept that vow. The most famous mysteries were at Eleusis, a small city near Athens, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. And I'll be making a dedicated video on the Eleusinian mysteries soon, so we'll go much deeper there. But to understand what we're talking about here, the myth behind them matters. Demeter, goddess of grain, loses her daughter Persephone to Hades, lord of the dead, who drags her down into the underworld. Demeter's grief is so overwhelming that the crops fail, the earth goes barren, and humanity starts to starve. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Persephone will spend part of the year below and part above. When she returns, the earth blooms. When she descends, winter comes. That's the myth. But the mysteries weren't just a retelling of the myth. They were a ritual enactment, an experience. Every autumn, thousands of initiates made the journey from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way. 30 kilometers of road, a full day's walk. They fasted. They carried sacred objects in covered baskets. Torches burned in the darkness, and somewhere along the road, a divine name was cried out into the night. The cry of Iakos, a figure associated with Dionysus, whose name became the call of the procession itself. And then they arrived at Eleusis. They entered the great initiation hall, the telesterion, as the ancient Greeks called it, and something happened. We don't know what. The initiates kept their vow. Across centuries, through the rise of philosophy, through the Roman conquest, through the spread of Christianity, the secret held. What we know, from fragments and careful allusions, is that there was something shown, something said, and something done. And the effect, by many accounts, was transformative. Sophocles called those who had seen the mysteries thrice blessed. Cicero, writing centuries later and from outside the Greek world entirely, said that Athens had given nothing more valuable to humanity than the Eleusinian mysteries, that they taught people not only how to live with joy, but how to die with better hope. What was that hope? We can't be sure, but the shape of it seems clear enough. Demeter's grief, Persephone's descent, and the return from below. This wasn't just a story about seasons. It was a story about death and what might come after it. And the initiates who went through the rites of Eleusis were, in some sense, enacting that story in their own lives. They came out different. That much the sources agree on. And this is an important point. The mysteries were not a secret hidden religion underneath public Greek religion. They were part of the same world. The same person could sacrifice to Athena at the Panathenea and be initiated at Eleusis. The mysteries added a personal, inner dimension to a religious life that was otherwise mostly communal and external. There were other mysteries, too. Rites dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy we met earlier, spread across the Greek world and offered their own encounters with transformation and altered states. Separately, there were the Orphic traditions, a different current altogether, focused less on ecstatic ritual and more on texts and teachings about the soul's journey after death. Remarkably, some of these have survived, inscribed on thin gold leaves, buried with the dead across the Mediterranean. They read like instructions for a journey. Scholars who have studied them describe them as guides for the newly dead, telling them which path to take, which spring to avoid, what words to speak to the guardians of the underworld. Not mythology, actual instructions buried with actual people for what comes next. What the mysteries show us is that Greek religion wasn't only civic and communal. Beneath the public festivals and the shared sacrifices, there was a hidden dimension too, something personal, something transformative, something that changed the people who experienced it. It had room for the public altar and the secret initiation, for the civic festival and the personal transformation. Both were real. Both mattered. Which brings us to the question I think you've been quietly asking this whole time. Did the Greeks really believe it? And the honest answer is, it's complicated, but not in the way you might expect. Greek religion was not organized around belief in the way that, say, Christianity is. There was no creed, no catechism. Nobody asked you, at the entrance to a sanctuary, whether you held the correct theological opinions about the nature of Zeus. As Warrior puts it, the correct performance of ritual was the essence of traditional Greek religion, not faith, not belief defined by creed or doctrine. You were judged by what you did, not by what you thought. And this is where it gets interesting. Because it doesn't mean the Greeks had no opinions about the gods. They clearly did, and some of those opinions were radically critical. Xenophanes, a philosopher writing in the late 6th century BCE, pointed out that humans project their own image onto the divine. He made the famous observation that if horses had gods, their gods would look like horses. He proposed instead a single divine mind, unlike anything human. That's not the thinking of someone who doesn't take the question seriously. That's someone who takes it more seriously than most. Plato, in the 4th century, worried about the moral quality of Homer's divine stories. Gods behaving badly in poetry was, he thought, a bad influence. He wanted the stories censored in his ideal city. Again, this isn't skepticism. It's a form of theological seriousness that holds the gods to a higher standard than the poets do. And the tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, spent their entire careers wrestling with divine justice on the public stage, at festivals, in front of the entire city. Why do the innocent suffer? Why do the gods punish the virtuous? Is Zeus actually just? In Euripides' plays especially, the gods can behave in ways that are shockingly cruel, and the audience is left to sit with the discomfort. These aren't the questions of people who've stopped caring. These are the questions of people who believe deeply and are troubled by what they believe. And remember, tragedy was performed at a religious festival. The Dionysia was a civic religious event held in honor of Dionysus. The plays were preceded by sacrifices and libations. The theater itself was sacred space. So the Greeks were using their own religious festivals as the occasion to question their own gods, publicly, dramatically, in front of tens of thousands of people. That's not a culture that's afraid of doubt. That's a culture where doubt and devotion coexist, and where the sacred is strong enough to contain the questioning. And through all of this, all the philosophy, all the tragedy and the intellectual debate, the sacrifices continued. The festivals were observed. The sanctuaries received offerings. The oracle at Delphi kept answering questions. Part of the reason is something we touched on earlier. The gods weren't fixed theological concepts that required precise belief. Zeus wasn't one thing. He was a thunderbolt king at Olympia, a household protector in a simple jar, a guardian of oaths, and a snake-shaped underworld power. All at the same time, all in different places. You didn't need a consistent theology of Zeus. You needed to approach the right Zeus for the right moment. The gods were real in the way that mattered, real presences in the world, whose favor was worth seeking and whose anger was worth avoiding. What you privately believed about their deeper nature, that was your own affair. And then, gradually, something began to change. We started this video with a question. How did one of history's most religious civilizations end up remembered as mythology? We now have enough of the world in front of us to start answering that. The transformation wasn't sudden. It happened in stages, each one preserving something and losing something else. The first stage happened within Greek culture itself. From the 5th century BCE onward, philosophers began lifting the gods out of the altar and into the lecture hall. Xenophanes criticized anthropomorphism. Plato proposed philosophical alternatives to the poet's gods. The Stoics went further. They reinterpreted the gods as allegories for natural forces. Zeus is fire, Hera is air. The gods, in this framework, weren't beings you sacrificed to. They were ideas you contemplated. And crucially, some philosophers began drawing a sharp line between the myths as told by poets, which they saw as just stories, and the deeper philosophical truth they believed lay beneath them. The myths, in this view, were just wrapping paper. Beautiful, traditional, culturally important, but ultimately a human invention that could be stripped away without losing the divine truth underneath. None of this killed the cults. People kept sacrificing. But it opened a gap between the intellectual tradition and the ritual tradition, between the gods of the lecture hall and the gods of the altar. And that gap would widen over time. The second stage was scholarly. As the historian Simon Price notes, between roughly 250 BCE and 150 CE, mythological handbooks began appearing. Reference works that organized Greek divine stories into neat genealogies and narrative summaries. The most famous, the library attributed to Apollodorus, became the foundation for many modern mythology textbooks. These were useful, practical reference guides for readers who wanted to understand classical literature. But they were literary tools, not religious documents. The ritual world behind the stories, the altars, the festivals, the processions, the household offerings, simply wasn't their concern. The stories were extracted from the world that produced them and collected as a body of knowledge in their own right. This matters more than it might seem, because it's the moment when Greek religion begins to become Greek mythology, when the stories start circulating independently of the practices that gave them meaning. The third stage was Rome. Roman culture absorbed Greek religion deeply, but it absorbed the literary and artistic layer most enthusiastically. Roman poets, Ovid above all, retold Greek myths with extraordinary skill. The Metamorphoses is a genuine literary masterpiece, full of vivid storytelling and psychological insight. But Ovid's gods are characters in a poem. They're witty, dramatic, psychologically complex, and entirely disconnected from any altar or sanctuary or sacrificial fire. Ovid wasn't writing a religious text, he was writing literature. And that's how the Roman world increasingly received the Greek gods, as literary figures, as cultural inheritance, as aesthetic objects. The fourth stage was the most decisive. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean, the living practices of Greek religion were progressively closed down. Temples were converted into churches or dismantled for building material. Festivals were banned or absorbed into the Christian calendar. Sacred groves were cut down. Cult statues were destroyed. The Emperor Theodosius banned all pagan cults in 393 CE. Burkert notes the date precisely. The Olympic Games and the Eleusinian Mysteries, two of the most ancient institutions in the Greek world, both stretching back centuries, ended at the same moment. The last sacrifice at Olympia. The last initiation at Eleusis. After more than 1,000 years, the rites went silent. What survived after that was literature. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the tragedies, the philosophical dialogues, the mythological handbooks. These passed into the Western tradition through the hands of scholars and monks, and eventually, Renaissance humanists who found ancient Greek literature beautiful and worth preserving. And what the Renaissance received was the beautiful surface, the stories, the characters, the drama. Think of Botticelli painting the birth of Venus, or Michelangelo covering ceilings with ancient gods. Magnificent. But the smoke was gone. The altar was gone. The fear, the festival, the silence after initiation, all of it gone. What remained were characters in stories. Beautiful, immortal characters, but characters nonetheless. So the myths became mythology, and the religion disappeared. Now let's come back to where we started. We began by saying that most of us know the Greek gods, and we do. We know their names, their stories. We know them as characters. But now I think we can see what stood behind the characters. Not just mythology, a world. A world where the gods weren't figures in stories, but presences in daily life. At the hearth fire before breakfast, at the altar during the festival, in the darkness of the procession to Eleusis. None of that is mythology. All of it is religion. And I think the most important thing this episode leaves us with is a simple distinction. The myths were the stories Greeks told about the gods. Religion was how they lived with them. Those are two very different things. And for a long time, we've had the stories without the world that made them meaningful. That's not necessarily a tragedy. The stories are extraordinary. They've fed literature and imagination for 2,500 years. But it's worth knowing what we're missing. Because what we're missing is the world itself. A world whose ideas, about the gods, about ritual, about the sacred, traveled far beyond Greece, into Christian theology, into Islamic philosophy, into the way people across the globe have thought about the divine ever since. That was Greek religion. Not just myths, a world. I hope this gave you a richer sense of what Greek religion actually was. If you want to go deeper into any of the topics we touched on today, the mysteries, the gods, the ancient world, there will be dedicated videos coming on all of that, so it might be worth subscribing if you haven't already. Also, all the books we used to research this episode are linked in the description below. If any of them catch your interest, picking them up through those links is one of the easiest ways to support the channel. You can also support us on Patreon. That link is down there too. And if you want to keep exploring ancient Greek history, I've put some related videos on screen. Click on whichever one calls to you. I'll see you there.